with microservices, it's also possible to make, a huge ball of, mud with a lot of APIs that are interconnected in a really poor way.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 194, How to Write Test Cases for Microservices. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, it's now 2023, and we're still fighting the same problems over and over again. And one of those problems is testing.
I thought that's easy to solve, man. Just don't test.
Oh. Well, that's true. I guess we could just forget testing, and that would be the end of the episode.
Exactly.
But that would be no fun.
Trust your developers. Trust the code. And in the worst case scenario, customers are going to tell you if it doesn't work.
Well, that is the true form of testing is your customers.
Exactly.
But today we have Darko Fabijan on from Semaphore. Darko, how are you doing?
Great, thank you.
And we're going to be talking about testing, and not just testing, but testing microservices. I mean, come on, think about it. How hard can it be to test 200 things all at once?
Well, it's definitely doable. The question is, what was the journey to those 200 microservices? I guess they are spawning up one by one and not 200 at once, which is a big thing. I mean, generally, it really depends. Is it like a greenfield project that, team is starting and it's going to be microservices from the get-go? Or from, what I'm speaking with people, it's usually like 5 or more like 10-year-old application. And people have their journey, and they are marching towards microservices for very, very, very different reasons. Some valid, some not. But I would maybe also love to hear you guys on the topic of maybe greenfield project, microservices, or start with monolith and then progress to monorepo, to microservices. Sorry.
I mean, one of the issues I'm having with, doesn't matter whether it's all microservices or some microservices, some monoliths, is really what is the scope of testing in terms of, do I test only and exclusively the application that I just released or want to release? Do I test it together with the first layer of neighbors? Do I test the whole system? And how do I do that? Let's go crazy. How do I do that on every pull request, right? To me, that establishing the scope is really, because in the big systems, you're not going to test the whole system. Simply, that is not going to happen. Let's say, Google scale. You're not going to test everything. That is not going to happen. So the question is really, or if you're small, you are, but what are you really testing?
Yeah, for sure. I can share our experience, and that's like that's certain scale that some people might resonate with, and that's what I'm kind of comfortable speaking about. Our team is, let's say, around 25 engineers, and our journey went from having like almost like a 10-year-old monolith, and then we were, slowly over the years, we were chopping some things off even before microservices kind of become really hot topic. During that process, we decomposed that to about like 20 services. I don't know if I would call them micro or microservices or mini services or wherever they live. And that's what we are living with today. In the monolith, we used to have like end-to-end test suite that was actually unfortunately quite beefy, maybe like 45 minutes plus if you execute it on a single thread. But that brought a lot of peace of mind to our team as we were releasing that. And as we were moving to chopping services off, at some point we just stopped testing everything together. And for us, it was like, it was a bit of like uncomfortable moment, but we lived with that for quite a while. And we were unsure. On one hand, you can say everything should be deployable independently and you will be fine. And you have your KPIs for your services that they must fulfill. And for me personally, when I was speaking with Dave Farley, and he's operating on a different scale. I mean, he had that quote that, if you are testing everything together and you have microservices, then you're pretty much not getting anything because you don't have that release independently, be responsible for the scope of your microservice and make sure that it delivers on the promise to other microservices. And let's say in the shared, psyche of our team, those words are like were, made us, more relaxed in that realm, and we just continued moving forward without testing the stuff together, and that includes neighbors. As you said, maybe the first neighbor or neighbors which are maybe a bit more distant. So that works well for us. And I think when it comes to testing and microservices, in general, there are stories about Netflix with thousands of microservices in just recent couple of days through Twitter drama. We heard that they also have like 1,000 plus. They also have like 1,000 plus engineers. I mean, at least in my mind, potentially the strategies are different if it's like 50 people team or it's like 500 or 2,000 people team. What's your view on that? Does it really matter, or the principles should be stay the same and uniform across different organizations and team sizes?
Ignoring now the testing specifically, I do believe that ideal situation, and I'm stressing ideal, is that each team is self-sufficient, independent, right? The moment one team needs to wait for some other team to do something, whatever that something is, we're in a very, very, very bad situation, right? And if I extrapolate that to testing, that means that I have to figure out a way to test whatever I'm working on without relying on anything specific from, artifacts of other teams, whatever those artifacts are. Now, the real question is, how do we get there? Like, do we mock the neighbors? Do we connect whatever I'm testing to everything else in production or some third solution, right? And I must stress that I'm also very, very religious about being able to test every single PR. I remember like 10, 20 years ago, long time ago, in one of the companies I worked at, where actually we had to wait in a queue. You had staging 1, staging 2, and then you can do something. Forget about PRs and all those things. You can validate something when your turn comes to maybe use the staging environment, which to me was, it was very, very painful at that time.
And if you fail, then you go to the end of queue and wait again.
Exactly. And you're probably going to fail because nobody at that time knew what staging is in the first place, kind of. And it was a nightmare, right? But today I'm guessing that we're talking about some form of ephemeral environment where every pull request gets its own environment. And the question is mostly, what do we put in that environment? Is it only the one that the application in question or something else, right? And what that something else is. Hopefully those ephemeral environments are some kind of scale to zero type of environments, but that would be probably a separate subject.
Yeah. I mean, to connect to that concept topic of a team, then, we can look at it as we are a team of 5. We have our products, and we are publishing our APIs. We have our uptime and other attributes that define the quality of services that we are providing. And then almost look all other teams as they are like third-party APIs, and believe that they are going to be up and have low latency and fast response time, and all those good attributes. And in this scenario, kind of it's almost self-explanatory. What's our responsibility and what should we test and what can we take for granted.
So do you guys define or APIs or changes to APIs in advance before you start developing whatever is behind those APIs? Some kind of a contract?
We do. I mean, in very, very practical terms, what we have is an separate repository on GitHub called internal API, and it specifies like gRPC API endpoints. Yeah, gRPC has some nice attributes. How you can define and extend your APIs and deprecate them over time. So some very good practices there. And yes, that's what we essentially do. As something is going to change, we are going to publish that, assign people that we think that are relevant, that can review those changes, and not ideally, but in practice, if we are introducing new API, that the old API is going to stay for a while, and we'll allow the teams connecting to the API to transition gracefully to those other APIs, and that works very, very well for us. Again, at certain scale, I'm not sure if it breaks. It probably does in some ways. Maybe some new processes and agreements need to be put in place, but yeah, that's how we work in terms of APIs.
I would actually go as far as to say that what you're describing is even more important at bigger scale. Because realistically, if I can be certain that I send messages and receive messages from some endpoint, from some API correctly, do I really care about what's on the other side?
Not at all, and you shouldn't. That should
Exactly.
be the beauty. Yeah.
But I feel that we have a psychological problem over there. Whenever I tell people something very similar to what you just described, I have a feeling as if people's brains cannot wrap around, okay, so we're not really doing system level testing everything, kind of like, or you're doing it later. No, kind of. But how are you doing it? I have a feeling that people cannot let go the idea that the whole system needs to be tested one way or another.
I can relate to that, people. We internally had that feeling for maybe year and a half. There is a level of anxiety that just lives within you, because on one side you have all green, all those thousands of tests, and for years you have relied on that everything is green, is going out into production, you feel safe. And now you have not those thousands, but you have this subset, and it's going out, and you have to overcome that. So from that perspective, I can relate to those people.
It's almost as if we lose that comfort from other people confirming that what we did is right, in a way, right? Because if we all test together in a way, then I don't rely on myself anymore, right? I rely also on you catching my issues in a way, right?
That's true. And you can say that maybe even it can be scientifically, statistically confirmed that in that realm, other people also testing my service, the confidence level is objectively higher that things are working than if it's only us who are testing this service. And then probably connecting to all of this comes, observability of the whole system, and monitoring. So once it gets out, how quickly we are going to find out if certain of our APIs have a regression in any way. I just wanted to add that that was an element that also took us a while, because our dashboards in Grafana, concretely, needed to expand and be, there are many more things that you have to look after in terms of monitoring your services, because a lot of calls that are just calls within the single process that are just going to happen. You don't have to worry much about that. And those calls are, RPC calls, or invoking a method which lives, on the other part of the network. There is also that layer that gets introduced, and you do have to significantly level up in that realm. So maybe that anxiety that I was explaining, that we were talking about together, this is now like maybe a second biggest thing that you have to level up significantly to be able to live with service architecture, microservice architecture.
I often get the question in this type of discussions at one point, or a statement rather than a question, that goes along the lines, okay, so you're telling me about additional problems I'm having by splitting my application into more applications. Why are you doing it in the first place? What are the benefits, right? We got some downsides. What are the benefits then? Why do it in the first place?
Well, the single biggest thing that I see, that it's you can ship faster. I mean, majority of our customers that are, in that realm of a couple of hundred engineers and live with, old, very successful monolithic application from, 2010s, establishing a release pipeline where you can, test your application and release it in, let's say, under 10, 15 minutes. Doesn't have to be, super aggressive. It's really hard to accomplish that, because you need to get into that release train, and there are potentially hundreds of other people that want to release the same application. You just cannot deploy concurrently. It has to, each deployment has to go out one by one, and then you have those queues and release trains and all of that. And from the metrics that I see, that people tend to be, very happy if they can release their application in an hour. So everything is green. I want to get it out in front of the customers. And if it's going to be an hour, wow, that's amazing. And that can be a single small copy change, or anything like that. And the promise is, and also the reality for many people, if you have microservices, you should be able to run all your tests in under 5 minutes, deploy in under 5 minutes, and just move on and keep iterating. And that's almost like order of magnitude faster. So it's like 50 minutes, or we can get to 5 or 10. That's really significant. So I would say that's maybe the biggest benefit that we get. And in my mind, the second biggest, with microservices, it's also possible to make a huge ball of mud with a lot of APIs that are interconnected in a really poor way, and all of that. It's not going to save people from all the anti-patterns and so on, but it makes it much harder to intertwine things in a very, very bad way, as it's possible with a single code base. In the single code base, you can pretty much call almost any function from any class object that you have in your system, and reaching out across your application, across different modules that you should not be reaching out across to, is much easier. Where with microservices and those APIs, maybe that part of the development process is slower. When you are defining your API endpoints, you have to think maybe a bit more harder, and maybe people are going to scrutinize the changes that you are proposing in a bit harsher way. That then introduces that level of not introduces, but maybe strengthens those boundaries and what we are calling in which ways. So those are the two main ones. There are other ones when it comes to scaling the engineering organization and team and knowledge distribution and how tribal knowledge is handled and all of that. I would put them in those order, but I'm really curious, how would you order the benefits of microservices?
From my perspective, the one I like the most is removing the dependency. Dependency always leads to lean time, to waiting and waiting and waiting. I remember one team finishing something, a feature, and then waiting for a week until the other team finishes the feature, because one feature depends on the other in the same code base, and then they need to jump in. And it was, it is hard also, very hard to, in a single code base, single monolith, very hard to establish those rules that make internal calls backwards compatible so that you don't depend on another. I mean, it can be done, but it's all, I feel like that having those physical boundaries foster certain type of behavior, certain practices, which you could, just to be clear, you could establish in a single code base, in a monolith, right?
Yeah. And that's an argument that a lot of people is making. It's possible there, it's possible. But yeah.
It's possible, but only if you ignore the human nature in a way, right?
Absolutely.
I want to go back to your ball of mud statement you said a few moments ago.
Yeah.
That's a distributed monolith. Why do people still persist in wanting to create balls of mud?
I will interject here. I don't think that ball of mud is necessarily... I want to hear your opinion, Darko, but distributed monolith is when you need to deploy and arrange release of the whole system, even though you split it into smaller pieces, right? Microservices or whatever we call it, right? So basically, you still have the same practice of how you release and how you manage things, even though it's split, when they're not independent of each other. And independently of whether it is truly microservices, meaning independently deployable applications, or distributed monolith, you can in both cases get a ball of mud. I'm not sure whether you agree on that, right? But so I see it as a very different things.
Yeah, people say that microservices kind of being ball of mud, but mixed with a lot of hair because of those connections that are in. So yes, it's getting there is absolutely possible. Yeah, on the topic of ball of mud, just the fact that something is big, and is living all together and so on, if it's like properly modularized, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But as Victor said, the level of discipline and craftsmanship and technical maturity in the organization has to be on a very, very, very high level, so the application doesn't end up turning into that ball of mud. And those physical boundaries, and in more abstract terms, just constraints, can prevent that. And I think that constraints are very, very useful, in many realms. And this is just an example of that, I would say. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is we were nice and happy when we had these big end-to-end thousands upon thousands of test suites running, or a test suite with thousands of tests. And if we're really going to go to microservices, we need to break up the monolithic end-to-end testing, just like we've broken up our monolithic app, and create micro tests and have a great dependence now, a constraint, if you will, that we have to have observability in there. Is that a fair statement?
It is. Absolutely. And we have to say goodbye to a portion of those end-to-end tests. I think that is a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think that's one of the confusing parts where people say, hey, we're breaking stuff into independently deployable microservices, and then we expect it not to be independently testable. It's almost like a contradictory thing, right? Because the moment it stops being independently testable, it stops being independently deployable as well, or vice versa.
Exactly.
One of the other things that you said earlier that I'm still trying to get my head around. I see it, but I don't always agree with it, is getting something deployable in under 5 minutes. People want to stretch for that, 5 or 10 minutes, right? Just something in the, single, really low number of minutes versus hours. But unless they have completely decomposed into smaller pieces, independently testable smaller pieces, will they ever be able to get there on a consistent basis?
I think that the short answer is just yes, but let's say that as this transition is happening, that big monolith still exists. Let's say that big monolith takes 50 minutes to run the test suite and deploy and all of that. And as we extract a small piece, let's call it a sign-up service, that sign-up service those tests can be run in, let's say, 3 minutes and deployed in 5. So we are under 10. If we are going to treat that sign-up service as like a third-party service, so we have our APIs, we have our uptime, and other attributes that they're describing that service, then we can independently deploy that service, and that's great. Let's for a second talk about that monolith, which is still together. Then that service also has to, or people working on that service have to view the sign-up service as a third-party component that maybe just some other company is making. We don't have influence over them, but they should have their uptime and not change the API without announcement and all the other attributes that are needed. And we should just not test, I would say, together with that external service. I'm not 100% sure that I answered your question, but this was my line of thought.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. As you peel off from the monolith, and this goes back to your question back to us, was greenfield versus brownfield. As you're peeling something off from that monolith, treat it as a third-party service. And I haven't heard anybody say that explicitly before. And that's very interesting because if you're going to treat it as a third-party service, if it's going to be managed as a third-party service, it actually has to be run as a third-party service.
Exactly.
And that's probably hard to do within a lot of organizations because that's forcing a culture change within the organization.
Yeah, but without that, I don't think it's possible to get anywhere with microservices. I keep relying on that view it as a third-party service because that's a metaphor that it's easy to understand, and only if we are going to have those promises towards the other teams sitting at our rooms or wherever, we are going to get there. Yeah.
I would even say that if you don't treat it as third-party services, then you're inevitably going to end up having a distributed monolith that you mentioned a few minutes ago, right? Especially if you come from the monolithic world, right? You are going to go and say, oh, I want to do this, but for me to do this, can you please do that in your application? And then to do that in your application, you need to do something else over there. And then you enter into the same dynamic that we were then working on a monolith, right? And then you might be asking a question, apart from some technical reasons for breaking up your monolith, like scaling and things like that. Why did you do it in the first place? Because I'm not independent anymore. I cannot deploy. I mean, I can physically deploy maybe independently of you, but I just agree that you're going to do this because I depend on that.
Absolutely. And that dynamic that you just mentioned goes back to the culture piece. Culture is the most important thing, ultimately, within an organization and technical teams. Then of course, those cultural changes are hard to get to, and maybe it's worth touching on that topic. Propagating that culture through a bigger organization can be challenging, and getting the people on board and showing the value and all of that. So, yeah, if you guys have any war stories that you either heard or experienced firsthand, that is an interesting topic for sure.
Well, it's funny because in larger organizations, the culture is already to have services between. We have HR and we have IT and we have finance, but we never think about breaking those down inside those big umbrellas. It's just, those are what those are. Those are completely different functions, but we're typically, this is a little too broad, but we're typically incapable of being able to, within the umbrella, break it down. So if you're in an organization to where, going back to Victor's thing, I need to break up this monolith for scaling purposes, but I'm not willing to treat it as third parties, then a distributed monolith, at least for part of that monolith, is probably going to be the correct answer. And there's nothing wrong with that because your culture can only support that. Whereas if you have a culture that is willing to turn it into a bunch of 5-person companies, then microservices might be the right answer for you at that point. Or maybe you can't break it all the way down, but there's parts, using your sign-up example. I can spin out the sign-up example off to a third party. Like, I'm going to spin it out of the company anyway, so let's go ahead and just make it a microservice and treat it as a third party. So I don't think microservices is the answer, but it is an answer if all the constraints that we were just talking about.
You just mentioned examples like HR, and I think that that's the core of the problem. And that's that we tend to split within a company based on our expertise rather than business units. Because when you think about it, HR is a collection of people with the same expertise that is completely unrelated with any business requirement. I mean, of course, we need to have HR. I'm not advocating without, right? But that's just technical grouping of like-minded, similarly experienced people. And we do the same thing in development, right? Oh, we're going to have a team of Node.js developers, and we're going to have a manager for that team, and then we're going to have a team of, I don't know, like ops people and team of Go developers and team of testers and so on and so forth.
Our software aligns to how our organization is already created.
Exactly. And realistically, and I'm interpreting your words, Darko, you correct me, what we need to do is figure out the business division, kind of, okay, sign up can be one unit. And if it needs an HR person inside, then we put an HR person inside. I'm ridiculizing. You don't need HR for sign up, right? But that's the change that I feel is very often not done when people try to break the monolith.
Exactly. And yes, that HR person might be like a good example, just because it's so not realistic. But definitely, teams need to be independent, and adding that level of like business product, mission to each of those teams can really help, and I think strengthen the culture and the motivation and the goal that team has. And getting there for the organizations is not trivial, but I think that there are many pros. That if there is a will from the leadership side, that can be, people can get on board behind that, but teams do need support from the leadership. I mean, just an example which is not directly related to this, but can demonstrate what some companies need to do. So we are speaking with a potential client. It's a bank X, and after maybe a third call, we found out, okay, it's not a bank X, it's a bank X digital. Okay, but who are you guys? Well, they separated their, software, let's call it a software division, into a separate company. And that company is providing services to the bank. And the bank still owns like all the legacy systems, and the engineering teams are within that organization. But they have created this new organization that has, their own budget, their own CTO, their own people, and teams that are now set up to operate in a different way. So that's maybe just an example how Sometimes it's easier to start from scratch than to change the existing organization, which is, I don't know, maybe an example that's worth thinking about for, even for smaller companies.
I would even go as far as to say that that could be the only way for bigger enterprises. Because if you stay as a part of that big something, right, you're limited by constraints that were generated over 20 years of figuring out how to do things well with certain approach, right? I'm skeptical in all those cases and would often say, if you cannot remove those constraints, you will not be able to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish, right? And the only way to remove those constraints is to leave the company.
Yes.
I mean, I don't mean literally leave the company, but you need to create a company within a company, or if not a separate company, it's 10 of us who are privileged, and we do not really need to. We make our own rules in a way, right? That makes sense for us instead of following the existing rules. So big fan of company within a company approach. As long as you start small, kind of like that. Sometimes people create those new companies and put 1,000 people from the old one, and that's also not a good one.
Yeah, you really have to start from scratch. And just maybe Matt, for example of this, maybe a year ago or so, I was watching an interview with some, old industrialist from Australia, completely, not related to this. And he was like accusing government, hey, when I started my business in 70s, we had, 10,000 laws. Now, like how many, years later, I'm like in my 70s, we have 4 times more laws, and I don't see that we are better off in any way. Then over time, I noticed that there are some people who are also advocating for removing laws over time. They just have expiry date, or you're going to remove them somehow. And when you mentioned that organization, which is, maybe 50,000 people and for, 30 or 50 years in the market, they have so many, rules. And if you would just start maybe from the main, which is not something that should be taken lightly, but, security and compliance and all of that, you cannot start with the get-go from that. That should come and has its place, but over time, and in a specific way. Yeah, just that those organizations for sure have so many of those rules and bureaucracy that creeped in that it's impossible to move fast. And as you said, you have to spin off and start from blank slate, and then over time we're also going to become big and so on. But then we do still have maybe a decade of runway where we can operate in a very lean way and move fast.
Until you grow too large again, and then you have to split off again.
And then you die.
If I assume for a second that new laws in such a hypothetical country or new rules in a company, let's say that they're for the better, right? They're not always, but let's say that they are. The problem is really that what you said, nobody's removing the old ones.
Yeah.
So if you just add new rules and never remove an old one, then you're really in trouble, right?
Yeah, it piles up. It's impossible then to figure out, what applies and what doesn't. And the rule that was introduced in an organization, or a country in 90s was probably very, very good and helpful at that point in time. But 20 years later, if that is still in place, then that's really not a good thing, and it's hindering the progress and the speed at which we can move for sure.
So Darko, I believe, I'd have to go back through all our history, is also a podcast host. And the podcast is called Uncut. And why don't you tell us a little bit about Uncut?
Well, Uncut maybe started roughly 3 years ago. And the idea was to, go live, essentially, that we would be, broadcasting live as we were, conducting interviews, talking about technology and all of that. So that's where also name comes from. Over time, it, progressed into being more of like traditional podcasts, such as this one. as the initial very creative idea was too stressful for the host, myself, and also for the guests. And we are covering topics that are connecting, closely to creating, products and engineering behind those products. And we like to cover, deep technical topics focused on, testing, CI, microservices, and all the related hypes and trends that come along.
And there are plenty of hype and trend things that are always coming along, as you probably know well. So Darko, if people wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, they can, reach me at Semaphore CI/podcast or Darko Fabijan at Twitter. And Semaphore Uncut, just Googling Semaphore Uncut is probably the easiest way.
And we'll have all those links down in the show notes. Darko, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. It was great.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.